rat hit his stomach before he could suck in a breath. Just a burlap sack dropped into his lap, heavy and shifting, the scratching already starting through the fabric. He tried to twist away, but the ropes held him against the post. The men standing over him didn't bother with threats or speeches. They just pressed the wooden bucket down over the sack and pinned it hard against his ribs. Everyone in Antwerp knew what came next. You could hear the rat clawing for a way out. And if the only way out was through the man strapped to the chair, well, that was his problem. This was Antwerp in 1589, a city that once bragged about being the richest port in Europe and was now rotting from the inside. The Spanish blockade strangled the harbor, merchants were going bankrupt by the week, and justice had become a rented service. If a shipment vanished, or a porter skimmed pepper from Levantine crates, you didn't bother with a judge. You sent 2 men to drag him off the docks, tie him to a chair, and convince him to talk before the rat got hungry enough to start digging for daylight. People later called them the Black Cellar Men. That wasn't their real name. That was the one the city whispered because no one wanted to say they'd hired them. They weren't mystics or monsters. They were dock workers with better pay and worse morals. The kind of men who'd perfected the rhythm of this work. Strap the suspect down, drop the rat, hold the bucket, wait. The prisoner broke before the rat ever drew blood. They almost always did. Antwerp wasn't some medieval nightmare out of legend. It was a global trading hub collapsing under war, debt, and starvation. And in the collapse, brutality didn't arrive. It surfaced. These basements became the unofficial courts of a city whose officials pretended everything was still under control. They weren't. The real decisions were made in rooms like this, with rope, buckets, and rats. And this was only the beginning. Antwerp in the late 1500s was a city trying to stand upright with half its bones broken. Anyone who knew it before 1585 would have sworn it was invincible. The financial heartbeat of Europe, a place where Florentine bankers, English wool merchants, Portuguese spice traders, and German metal dealers all fed off each other in one roaring marketplace. And then the Spanish siege hit. The gates closed, and everything collapsed so fast people didn't even have time to mourn the version of the city they lost. When Parma's army tightened its grip around Antwerp, the city starved. Not in some metaphorical, poetic sense. Literally, food vanished. Animals were eaten down to the bone. There were eyewitness accounts of people paying the kind of money you'd normally use to buy a ship's cargo just to get a few handfuls of grain. And when the Spanish finally forced Antwerp to surrender in August 1585, half the population fled north within months. The people who made the trade routes run, the merchants, the printers, the bankers, they were gone. What remained was a shell with its pride scraped off. A city that owed back taxes to the Spanish, owed debts to families who had already escaped, and owed food to citizens it could no longer feed. And when a city loses that many people, something strange happens. The physical infrastructure doesn't shrink. The buildings stay, the warehouses stay, and, most important for what came next, the underground cellars stay. Antwerp was built on soft, damp soil, the kind that forced people to build downward as much as upward. Almost every home had a cellar. Tavern owners had 2 or 3. Merchants had entire labyrinths beneath their properties, meant for storing grain, wine, textiles, anything that needed to stay cool and dry. When the economy collapsed, the cellars didn't empty. They waited. The city above ground was tightly controlled by the Spanish crown, with patrols and curfews and religious policing. But below ground, That was another jurisdiction entirely. The courts were overwhelmed, the city guard was understaffed, and corruption ran through the magistrates like rot in a barrel of apples. If a merchant wanted answers about stolen cargo, or a guild master wanted to deal with a rival quietly, or a Spanish officer wanted information that didn't require paperwork, they turned to the same kind of men. Not fanatics, not supernatural villains. Just men who understood that a terrified debtor talks more clearly in a locked cellar than in a courtroom. The city's decay fed the work. Wages fell. Hunger gnawed at the dockside neighborhoods. Refugees from the countryside poured in with nothing but desperation. Antwerp had always been a magnet for sailors, smugglers, and petty criminals. But now, it was a magnet with its moral compass broken. Men who would have otherwise worked on ships or in guild workshops suddenly had no steady trade. And some jobs don't require training, only a lack of hesitation. Meanwhile, rats weren't some dramatic symbol of decay. They were a constant nuisance in a city built on damp ground and emptied warehouses. You couldn't walk through certain alleys at sunrise without hearing them shifting under the stones. When people started whispering about the things that happened in basements, the screams, the chained captives, the confessions dragged out of men who had nothing left to give. The rats weren't part of the rumor. They were part of the background noise. And that's the truth most histories sand down. Antwerp didn't develop a torture-for-hire problem because the people were especially cruel. It developed one because the system that prevented cruelty had collapsed. When official justice becomes slow, corrupt, or impossible to access, someone else fills the vacancy. The economy was broken. Trust in institutions was gone, and violence became a service people were willing to pay for. The Spanish administration tolerated it, as long as it didn't threaten their political control. Merchant families tolerated it because it protected their investments. Ordinary citizens tolerated it because speaking too loudly about it was a good way to vanish into a basement yourself. Every city with an underworld has a moment where the line between rumor and reality snaps. For Antwerp, that moment came when everyone realized the cellars weren't just storage spaces anymore. They were courts, prisons, interrogation chambers. The underside of a city that still pretended it was functioning normally. The black cellar men didn't appear out of nowhere. Antwerp built them, brick by brick, failure by failure, silence by silence. Once Antwerp limped out of the worst famine years, it didn't bounce back. It hardened. The city kept its manners in daylight, but after dark it behaved like a place held together by debt and distrust. The magistrates could write whatever laws they wanted. Everyone knew the real negotiations were happening in doorways, back rooms, and basements. Anytime commerce stalls but money still needs moving, people find new ways to collect what's owed. You start seeing it in the court records around 1588. Street altercations, merchant disputes, disappearances, always written in that polite bureaucratic Latin that leaves out the bruises. Antwerp was full of men who had learned violence during the war and had no intention of going back to farm life. They drifted into the city and found employment with whoever paid fastest. Merchant houses, smugglers, debt collectors, sometimes even the Spanish garrison. A soldier's skill set didn't expire just because the siege ended. And then there were the undercrofts, the vaulted cellars beneath half the houses in the old quarter. They'd been built originally for storage when Antwerp was drowning in trade. Barrels of herring, cloth shipments, sugar from the Caribbean, spices worth ransoms. When the economy collapsed, those spaces didn't stay empty for long. They became holding rooms, interrogation rooms. places where someone could be reminded firmly about a loan repayment schedule. A surprising number of these cellars show up in 16th and 17th century property disputes. Owners complained about unauthorized activities happening beneath their floors. One widow sued her neighbor because he'd knocked through a wall underground to create a passage between their basements. He claimed it was for drainage. Everyone knew it wasn't. Antwerp's entire underside was a network of stone corridors built for commerce and repurposed for pressure. And yes, the rats were everywhere. The siege had left waste, uncollected grain, and collapsed structures, paradise for rodents. By 1590, the city was running official rat catcher bounties, and chroniclers mention the problem constantly. Have that in mind when you imagine a debtor being shoved into a cellar with a lantern, 2 enforcers, and a floor that skittered. Meanwhile, above ground, Antwerp still pretended to be Antwerp. The guilds held their meetings. The churches ran their feast days. But the city was living on borrowed identity. Its great merchant dynasties were gone or bankrupt. Smuggling solved the cash problem. English cloth, banned Protestant books, unregistered silver, spices rerouted through backdoor channels. The Spanish authorities wanted control, the locals wanted survival. Shadow economies grow fast in that kind of tension. One fascinating detail: by 1600, Antwerp had one of the highest reported rates of nocturnal assault in the Low Countries. That's the term the magistrates used when someone clearly got jumped and refused to name names. It usually meant the attacker was connected to someone with influence. A merchant house, a shipping family, a Spanish officer, or a criminal outfit that the police didn't dare provoke. Silence was safer than honesty. And there's a pattern historians point to. When violence becomes predictable, it becomes professional. Antwerp didn't have an official mafia, but it had consistency. The same tavern saw the same bruisers. The same alley off Vlasmarkt hosted the same nighttime negotiations. Spanish troops looked the other way, unless the violence targeted one of their own. The city had entered a strange afterlife. Antwerp didn't fall, and it didn't heal. It adapted. A place once built for trade now used its infrastructure to manage fear and enforce debts. That's the story beneath the Romantic paintings. Not some legend of masked executioners stalking the fog, but a city whose wounds never closed, and whose people learned to live for in the scar tissue. If Antwerp had a signature horror in the 1590s, it wasn't swords or pistols, it was rats. The city was overrun with them after the siege. Grain stores had burst, corpses had gone uncollected, and half the lower district had collapsed into rubble that served as perfect nesting grounds. Contemporary accounts mention black rivers of rodents moving through alleyways. The city issued bounties, but killing rats was like bailing out the ocean with a spoon. And when a city gets desperate enough, its cruelty gets creative. Some of the earliest documented uses of rat torture in the Low Countries appear right after the fall of Antwerp, and they weren't invented by criminals. They were copied from military interrogations. Spanish troops had used rats on prisoners during the war, and local muscle learned fast. Antwerp wasn't unique in this. Similar methods show up in Brussels, Ghent, and even Amsterdam. But Antwerp's undercrofts made it especially effective. Small rooms, thick walls, ground-level entrances where rats lived by the dozen. The Black Cellar men, those unofficial debt enforcers and freelance bruisers floating between merchant houses, taverns, and smuggling networks, didn't invent torture. They just used what the city handed them, and Antwerp handed them rodents. The method is mentioned obliquely in a 1599 deposition from a grain merchant named Peter de Wilde, He describes being held in a cellar near the old fish market. His wrists were tied, and a pottery bowl was placed over his stomach. A lantern was brought close to the bowl, heating the clay. Rats trapped underneath panicked, and they did what rats do when they have nowhere to go. They dug. The magistrates glossed it as coercive inducement. Peter called it hell. A similar case appears in 1602, where a debtor claimed enforcers tied a rat inside his breeches and left him overnight. The record doesn't detail the injuries, just notes substantial lacerations. And these weren't exotic sadists. These were working men who knew the value of a tool that didn't leave a clean signature. Rats left irregular wounds, infections, sometimes nothing at all if the victim confessed quickly enough. Perfect for a city that wanted deniability. People sometimes imagine this as legend, but the Habsburg Netherlands was not a gentle place. Torture was openly used by courts, and unofficial violence flourished in the gaps. Antwerp's criminal economy borrowed techniques from state interrogations, then privatized them. Everything became a negotiation tactic. Starvation, cold, confinement, beatings, and rats. The cellars themselves helped. They were old wine vaults with narrow shelves, broken drainage holes, and gaps in the brickwork. Rats lived inside the walls. Some enforcers didn't even need props. They'd simply lock a man in a small chamber, shut the lantern behind them, and wait. Hunger pushes rats toward anything warm. In the dark, fear does the rest. Most of this operated inside a city trying very hard to maintain its dignity. Cathedral bells rang on schedule. Guilds continued meetings. Spanish administrators preached discipline. But beneath the streets was a parallel system. Raw, improvisational, efficient. And rats were currency in that system, creatures nobody valued, turned into instruments of pressure. By the early 1600s, Antwerp had developed a reputation among merchants from Cologne and London. If you missed a payment in that city, someone might take you down a staircase and introduce you to the things living under their floorboards. It wasn't superstition, it was infrastructure. Rats survived the siege better than the people did. And in Antwerp's recovery years, they helped enforce the city's new rules, not by design, but by availability. The rich had lawyers, the desperate had cellars, the cellars had rats. By the first decade of the 1600s, Antwerp looked stable enough on paper. Trade trickled back, new guild members were sworn in, Spanish patrols marched the ramparts. But underneath, the city was running on a double heartbeat. The official one beat slow and stiff. The other throbbed through the alleys and cellars where the old siege habits never died. The black cellar men didn't dissolve after the famine. They professionalized. Once merchants realized fear was faster than litigation, they began hiring the same groups again and again. Patterns show up in the court records. The same surnames appearing in different cases, always near violence, never convicted. You see references to collectors, agents, nightmen, and occasionally onderartsen, literally the underground ones. Antwerp didn't have a mafia. It had an ecosystem. The Spanish administration tried to clamp down, but their power was stretched thin. Garrison troops were rotated frequently. Many didn't speak the local dialects. And the city's economy was so fragile that kicking too hard at its underworld risked shutting down the very commerce Spain needed. So they learned to tolerate the bruise so long as it didn't bleed into politics. As long as the cellars stayed personal, debts, feuds, smuggling disputes, the authorities looked the other way. One case says more about Antwerp than any sermon. In 1607, 2 enforcers were briefly arrested after a merchant's apprentice was found half-conscious near the Scheldt docks, bite marks up his thighs and a shattered pinky. He'd owed money on a shipment that spoiled. The men were held for a day, questioned, then released without charges. The official note says, "Insufficient cause." The translation is simple. They worked for someone important. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens lived in a city shaped by contradiction. Antwerp had been built for greatness. Broad quays, tall guild halls, sprawling trade depots. But the people walking those streets carried the memory of starvation and betrayal. You can see it in the diaries. A cooper wrote in 1596 that locks on doors were thicker now than in my father's time. A seamstress complained in 1604 that she never walked near the Vlasmarkt after dark. Children were warned not to stray too close to cellar grates. That fear didn't come from imagination. The city's undercrofts had become pressure chambers, storage for goods when times were good, storage for people when times weren't. And the rats were still there, multiplying in the cracks. Antwerp hired rat catchers, issued bounties, even paid bonuses for pregnant females to cut down reproduction. But rats thrive where humans fail, and the city had too many neglected corners to police. Some enforcers began using that fact with disturbing skill. A property dispute from 1612 describes a basement found thick with rat droppings, cords, and a bench not for carpentry. Another mentions a cellar floor stained with something neither wine nor oil. These weren't theatrical torturers. They were men raised in a culture where cruelty never went out of fashion because it never stopped being useful. And yet, all of this existed beneath a city trying hard to pretend it was rising from the ashes. Antwerp's painters kept producing sunny market scenes and polished religious tableaux. Travelers from the north wrote admiringly about the rebuilt guild halls. But any local who'd lived through the siege knew better. The facade was fresh paint over old rot. A walk 2 streets off the main squares told the real story. The rats are in the literature. They're in the complaint logs. They're in the excavation reports from the 20th century. They're in the bones pulled out of fill layers beneath rebuilt homes. Whenever Antwerp tried to bury the past, the rats dug it back up. And that's where the story finally settles. Not in a single event, but in a transformation. After the famine, after the siege, after the plagues, Antwerp didn't collapse into lawlessness. It adapted to it. The city developed 2 survival strategies. One written in ledgers and proclamations, and the other carried out in the dark by men whose names rarely made it past a first initial. By the mid-1600s, Antwerp began clawing its way back into legitimate prosperity. Churches were restored, trade steadied, the Spanish grip loosened. But the underworld didn't disappear. It simply folded into the city's DNA. Rats still prowled the cellars. Enforcers still changed hands between merchants. Violence stayed convenient. That's the part nobody puts in the paintings. Antwerp didn't fall or rise. It calcified. The city learned to live with its trauma because there was no other choice. And beneath the polished guild banners and fresh facades, the old cellars remained, damp, dark, and full of the things that had kept Antwerp running when everything else stopped. In the end, the city survived. The rats survived. And the men who worked in the dark survived longest of all.